and unmute you.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Yep.
Can you just give me a thumbs up to make sure you can hear me okay? Yeah, that's looking good. Good. Yep, hello, I'm Jonah. I've noticed already there's quite a few of my friends in the audience. So hello, Kelvin. Hello, Huck from Melton Constable and Jerry Kinsley. Good to see you all. I'll share the screen and get started. So yeah, hopefully you can all see that. Yes, so I work for Norfolk Rivers Trust. We're a small but growing conservation organisation. We're just coming up to our 10th birthday now. And we've grown over that time from sort of one guy in an attic to I think 11 full-time employees now. And we're one of several rivers trusts all across the country, with the exception of a couple of small gaps. Oh, and I've just found out. No, sorry, Kelvin, that's your slide. Sorry, I'm just having a bit of struggle sharing my slides.
We can see that okay. Well, I can at least.
I'm just trying to get them to run in sequence. That's my struggle.
Right.
So has that gone black for you now, Andrew?
Has, yeah. Yeah, that's come up.
Okay, let's try this again. That's better. So yeah, what do we do? All kinds of aquatic conservation work, anything to do with rivers and streams and ponds and lakes and fens. And usually that is kind of classic conservation work, trying to make rivers healthier and make ecosystems more natural and function better. Outside of that, we do quite a lot of other stuff. We do occasional kind of access and recreation stuff, and work with volunteers, but quite a lot of community work as well, and educational work. We do a lot of work with local primary schools and secondary schools. And we do that pretty much anywhere in Norfolk, actually. I think the majority of our projects have probably been in North Norfolk and West Norfolk. The Broads Authority kind of take care of the Broadland areas, but yeah, pretty much anywhere in Norfolk and anywhere with water. Okay, there we go. And this is why we do it, really. And this, I find this slide a good explanation of what it is that we're trying to do. So this is a cased caddisfly. It lives on the bottom of a riverbed, and it's one of 200 or 300 species easily that you could step across if you step from one side of the river to another. These are quite diverse ecosystems. I couldn't tell you what species that is without going through a key, and I couldn't tell you in detail its habitat requirements. But the point of the caddisfly is, we know that if a river's healthy and if it's working as a functioning ecosystem, then that will provide good habitat for this caddisfly and all the other hundreds and hundreds of species that should be in there. So we're not particularly trying to create great trout habitat or heron habitat or anything like that, single species work. What we're trying to do is create functioning ecosystems that support all of these species. The slide sharing's going really slow, I'm sorry. That's better, okay. So, and most of our work is on chalk streams. Norfolk's rivers aren't exclusively chalk streams. But chalk streams are something that we have that are really special. And the clues in the name, I guess, it's the chalk that makes them unique, the ecology and the hydrology and the water chemistry. And why that is unlike an upland catchment or a clay catchment, the water in the river is not coming straight off the land and into the river and running over land. It's falling on Norfolk and percolating down into the chalk and then rising back up out of springs and fissures all across the county. And by doing that percolation into the chalk, it can take years and years and years to work its way back out into the rivers. And in theory, that comes out really clean, as I'll explain in a moment. So the map on the left of the screen shows you where the chalk streams are across England. You can see there's the kind of paler yellow is the actual chalk where it's exposed and where the chalk streams are classified. Norfolk's actually got a massive chunk of that. Hampshire and Wiltshire are arguably more famous for their chalk streams, the Test and the Itchen and those rivers. But actually Norfolk's got a huge chunk of England's and the world's chalk streams. There are about 210 rivers classified as chalk streams in the world. I'm slightly dubious about that because there are places like Brazil with loads and loads of chalk that get classified slightly differently. But they genuinely are unique ecosystems, and they get called England's rainforests and England's coral reefs, I think with very good justification. So going back to the chalk filtering the water, and the water percolating through the chalk, what that means is the water should come out very clean. It's basically being squeezed through a massive filter. So the water should come out very clean, and it should come out very constantly. If these were undamaged catchments, they wouldn't really suffer from floods and droughts because the woodland that would be around the catchments and the meadows and the chalk itself, that all acts like a massive sponge, and you can pour water on it and it'll hold it and release it slowly. So we should have very clean water, and we should have very constant flows, a lack of floods and droughts compared to other geologies and more upland sloping catchments, I guess. Also, the water should be very constant temperature. It should come out at something like 4 to 8 degrees all throughout the year. And it should be rich in minerals, things like magnesium and calcium and things that plants need to grow. Conversely, and this is quite important, I'll come on to this in a bit, it should be very poor in nutrients, things like phosphates and nitrates, and your kind of fertilizer chemicals. And what all this means is that this kind of constant clean environment, it means it's a very good environment for plant growth. They're not going to get flooded out. They're not going to get frozen out. They shouldn't be suffering from droughts and floods. Should have a good supply of minerals coming in. And that gives us a very productive environment for plant growth, which is one of the absolute, I don't know if bedrock's the right word, one of the absolute key features of a chalk stream. So the globally rare, as we said before, the Wensum's about one of 210 in the whole world. And they really are unique. They're all massively threatened because pretty much everything that makes a good chalk stream also makes a good arable environment. So these are areas that people have settled for millennia, I guess, and deforested and farmed, and it's allowed these areas to become very agriculturally productive. But all that modification and abstraction and in recent times pollution, that's threatening these rivers globally. But they are and they remain very rich in wildlife. Proper wind in the willows environment, this is something that gets used quite a lot in relation to chalk streams. I think wind in the willows was possibly Berkshire, maybe. But yeah, you can see Ratty is actually a water vole, and Norfolk really still supports a lot of this wildlife, kind of the classic lowland English chalk stream rivers. You can see waterfalls down there. The Wensum's certainly got good waterfall populations, lots and lots of those left. Disappeared for a massive proportion of the British range in recent decades, but holding on well in Norfolk. You can see the picture at the top shows kind of a typically diverse and verdant little chalk stream tributary there. And that's what they look like in summer. That's what really makes them special, that really lush and diverse plant growth. The crayfish are a bit of a different story. Bottom left, that's a native white-clawed crayfish. These are something that, let's say 30 years ago, Norfolk was a real stronghold for these creatures. Pretty much every river in Norfolk would have had really strong populations. And the Wensum did hold a lot of white-clawed crayfish until very recently. In recent years, we'll come on to in a little bit, they've been badly beaten up by the invasive American crayfish. So this is the Wensum. Don't worry about the small print on the map. What I wanted to do with this was kind of give you an idea of the scale of the river and the scale of the catchment. Everything that's shaded green is the Wensum catchment. So any rain falling in that whole area affects the Wensum. Any loss or gain of habitat in that whole area affects the Wensum. And it's not just the main river at all. The main rivers may be, I don't know, a third of the recognisable river or water body. It's also all these other tributaries going up to Dereham, going up towards Corston there. These tiny little streams coming in from everywhere. And they're really valuable. They're kind of the feeder streams, that's your water supply, but also incredibly important for fish and invertebrates. And the next slide just shows that in relation to towns. So the Wensum is mostly really quite rural, but by Norfolk standards, it's also got a fair amount of urban development there in Fakenham, Reetham and Dereham, without even considering Norwich. By Norfolk standards, that's really quite industrial. And that's reflected in some of the problems the Wensum's got as well that we'll come on to shortly. So typically it is a very arable catchment. Norfolk's a very arable county, and you know we benefit from that chalk geology and the water supply and the lack of floods and droughts and lack of difficult to farm slopes. All those things that make chalk streams special have also allowed Norfolk to become very productive. I think it's the most productive county for food in England. I think that's true to say. We've got all the usual things in the Wensum catchment: cereals, potatoes, sugar beet, pigs, all those things. Some of those come with their problems and some don't. But what it's also got is it still has little pockets of these absolutely amazing, just untouched corners of Norfolk, really special little bits of habitat. This is a spring at the top of one of the chalk stream tributaries, where water's just welling up out of the ground, trees left in it, which create amazing habitat as well. I'll talk about that in a bit, the importance of trees next to rivers. But the Wensum's still got a lot of this, just kind of hidden away. Often there's no public access and you never see it unless you're sent up there on survey work. But we've still got these real little beautiful untouched pockets. Now, this slide could take me about 3 hours to talk my way through. This is my favourite bit, I guess, and probably what a few people in the audience are most interested in. The Wensum is home to probably the majority of the fish species you find in England. I won't talk about its decline as a fishery particularly. That's not what tonight's about. But I do want to talk about the diversity of life in there. That's why I've got the slide. And it's got most things that a fisherman could dream of, quite honestly. Roach and rudd on the top left, and then dace on the top in the hand, and a perch in the other hand, and chub, and the thing in the centre with the speckles, for those of you that don't know, the really speckly fish right in the middle of the slide, that's kind of the chalk stream classic. So that's a brown trout, same species as a sea trout. Actually, they're exactly the same fish, just some hang around in the rivers and some go out to sea. And they should be present in pretty much every bit of chalk stream, if not every bit of river in the whole of the country. The Wensum's still pretty good for them. They really thrive in chalk stream habitat. They need the gravel beds to spawn in. They like to drop down into the deeper pools to feed. And because chalk streams are so rich in invertebrate life, the trout do absolutely fantastically there. They're eating up little shrimps and mayfly nymphs and all kinds of little creatures in there. Not stonefly, caddisflies, all these kind of things. And they do really, really well. And actually, they're quite distinctive. I kind of learned my career in Scotland and Yorkshire, and the trout numbers up there are equal, if not greater, actually, because there's much less fish diversity. But the chalk stream trout and the Wensum trout get to be real fatties. They've got really quite an easy life there and really quite a rich supply of food. So, yeah, certainly a chalk stream classic. On the right-hand side of the slide, down on the riverbed in the mud there, you can see an eel. These are certainly one of the most interesting creatures we've got in the river. I think probably most of you'll know that these are kind of international visitors. They spawn in the Sargasso Sea over towards the Caribbean, and they drift over the Atlantic as tiny little glass eels, barely big enough to see, and they hit the whole of the European coast. They're washed from the Sargasso Sea onto the whole European coast and make their way up into fresh waters. And eels will live pretty much anywhere it's wet and the flow's not too fast. And Norfolk is absolutely ideal for that. And the Wensum should be absolutely ideal for that. They love the slow rivers. They love ponds. They'll quite happily go across a meadow to get into a pond. Farm ditches, the Broads, all these watery habitats in Norfolk should be absolutely stuffed with eels. And they'll hang around for anything from 6 years to decades. They'll hang around in fresh water, and then they'll eventually decide it's time to go back to the Sargasso, change their body shape. They take on a lot of fat, their eyes change, the colour changes, they're camouflaged in a marine environment, and they'll set off on that several thousand-mile journey back again at the end of their lives to spawn. As far as we know, that's the final journey, and the young will then return to Europe and return to Norfolk. They've been in decline in the whole range. They're now critically endangered, which puts them on a level with, well, it puts them above a level of pandas, I think, now, on a level with tigers and species of rhino, I think, in the seriousness of their decline. Norfolk's still got eels in thousands, but previously they would have been in millions and millions. One of the big reasons, again, this is one of the problems of the Wensum, is the Wensum and all Norfolk's rivers are really chopped up by barriers, the old mills and weirs and things. And the young eels just can't migrate past them. So for an elver now to get from the sea to the very top of the Wensum is very difficult. That's something we're trying to do something about, but it's a long, long process. Other things we've got there, the roach is kind of the Wensum classic. You can see that top left, that's one of the anglers' favourites. Beautiful roach in the Wensum, beautiful colours of the fins in particular, and the kind of silver and red. Amazing fish. We think that the fishermen know they've been in quite serious decline for some years, but I think that's another big target for life we'd like to bring back to the Wensum. We've got a couple of other things. The huge fish down there is the pike on the kind of middle left. Again, very, very happy in the deeper bits of chalk streams and Norfolk rivers. They'll eat pretty much, in fact, most of these fish will eat most of the other fish, the perch and the trout and the pike and the chub. They'll all eat pretty much anything they can get their mouth around, and the eel as well. We've also got minnows. We've got 2 species of stickleback, although I've just represented one there. We've got bullhead, gudgeon, all kinds of things. One of my personal favourites is bottom right there. That's a Brook Lamprey. They're slightly odd. They don't have a jaw. They've got a sucker disc instead of a mouth. And their cousins, the river lamprey and the sea lamprey, they'll parasitise on big fish. They'll drift downstream and out to sea, and you'll see them stuck onto cod and salmon and things like that, literally sucking the blood out of them before they're big enough to make their way back. These little Brook Lamprey, they don't do that. Once they're adults, they don't feed. They just spawn and die. They spend most of their lives down in the silt, just growing and growing. And once they're big enough to metamorphose and spawn, they do it. And then, as far as we know, that's the end of their life cycle. And then the minnow, actually, on the right-hand side, the small fish between the eel and the lamprey. That's a minnow, not known to everybody as a distinct species, but they certainly are. They're species all of their own. It doesn't just mean little fish. They're absolutely beautiful. They'll change colour throughout the year. The Wensum's full of them, and they're another one of those key things in the food chain that pretty much everything will eat. Trout and eels will eat them, certainly pike will, otters, herons, everything. Minnows are a really, really important part of the food chain. And the reason we have all these fish is it's also a really rich and interesting environment for river invertebrates. I've just picked out a really small number of the highlights here, but I think it's fair to say that chalk streams are one of the best invertebrate habitats you could possibly have. Again, with the stable conditions and the plant life, and the diversity of them is absolutely staggering. If you go in with a net and have a kick around, tip it into a tray, you'll have tens of species in there within minutes, hundreds of species if you persist, and that's just out of a bit of river a couple of meters wide and 30 centimeters deep. The diversity and the kind of array of life in there is really quite special. Things in particular for the Wensum, the Damerland's wall snails there, you can see, they're the top picture, these tiny little snails. They're kind of a Wensum classic, and it's a real stronghold for them. They're doing quite well in the Wensum catchment, I think, but endangered in England, common in Norfolk, most common in the Wensum, critically endangered in Europe. So this just highlights the importance of this river for certain species. This is one thing that's really doing okay there, that's suffering absolutely everywhere else. Tiny little snail, not particularly attractive, or that exciting to, maybe the average person, but yeah, really quite special and endangered enough now that these creatures will hold up developments in the same way that waterfalls can and great crested newts can. Lovely little things. Kind of summer classic for the Wensum is the banded demoiselle. If you're there at the right time of year, sort of early summer, there are clouds of these around the river. We've been down doing fish surveys, and there have been absolute clouds of the banded demoiselles. They're beautiful damselflies, very close relation of a dragonfly. You can see the male there is blue with the band that gives it its name, the black band across its wings, and the female is this really emerald green colour. Very well camouflaged, but absolutely striking when you see it. And then back to the case caddisflies at the bottom. There are tens of species of these in the Wensum, loads and loads. And they're really interesting. They're all slightly different, and you can't quite identify a species confidently by the way it builds its house, but you can get very close to doing that. You can see, so the left hand of the three caddis species there build really quite neat, almost curved houses out of these tiny little stones. They'll carry that around with them, and basically use it as protection as a nymph. They eventually hatch out of the river. The adults you can see an adult on the right hand side there, and then a completely different species below uses these more coarse granules of gravel. You can put these in a tank and give them gold flakes. Actually, people do this on the internet. You find them building houses out of gold flakes that can be sold as jewellery. But there are other species that cut lengths of grass and use snail shells. Some make really neat cases. Some are just a real mess. But yeah, a massive diversity of life. And these are the real bedrock of the ecosystem. So they're herbivores and detritivores primarily, and they'll eat all that leaf matter and fallen wood and all that stuff that ends up in the river and really thrive on that, and then feed things like all the more carnivorous ducks and all the various fish species that just hoover these things up. I think the other thing that's important, kind of outside of the water, is the importance of, well, not just the Wensum, is the importance of rivers as corridors for nature. The Wensum illustrates this fairly well. You can kind of see the map there. You don't really need to see where the river is. If you look at the patches of dark green, what's gone on there is that these wet valley bottoms, they've always been too wet to farm and always been too wet to build on. So in places they've been left alone, and that's just left these massive strips, reasonably well joined up, of wild habitat cutting right through from the North Sea all the way into central Norfolk and meeting up with these rivers that drain down towards the fens and the Great Ouse there. Really important wildlife corridors. If you draw the river over that, you can see it slightly more clearly, the deep green all the way up through Lenwade and Bordeswell, a bit of a patch of green going off up Wendling Beck and the Blackwater up towards Gresson Hall, another bit going up Reefham up the other Blackwater there, kind of curving round at the top end. That's where the river is, and the river is usually where the habitat is. And that is reflected in the bird life. And that means the rivers become an important corridor for stuff. Birds follow where the food is. The invertebrates are in where the good habitat is, especially where there's wet habitat or where there's trees or meadows. That's where the birds migrate, and where there's trees they can shelter in. They migrate along these corridors. And probably so do things like migrating dragonflies, migrating bats, things like otters. They'll travel up and down the river corridor. They're pretty safe, you know, in the wilder habitat in the meadows and woods, much less safe out in the arabland town. So all these creatures use the river and the Wensum in particular as a corridor to migrate, corridor to move around. And again, there's some pretty special stuff to be found in the Wensum Valley. Corncrakes, I have heard there, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Reintroduced corncrakes, so these were ones that were released from Pensthorpe, I later found out, but had since been to Africa on migration and come back, and were trying to breed in the Wensum Valley, which once would have been a stronghold of them. Turtle doves are disappearing all over the country really quickly. The Wensum Valley's still got turtle doves, spoonbills, merlins, all these amazing species. But it also has big problems, as do all of Norfolk's rivers and actually all of England's rivers. Just let me take a drink a second. I haven't even tried to prioritize these. I've got kind of 6 huge problems that our rivers are facing, not in any particular order of priority. It changes depending on what I've looked at that afternoon, but the barriers that I mentioned before are really important. So the old mills and sluices, so many of these species are not necessarily fully migratory, you know, like they're not flying to Africa for the winter necessarily, but things like trout need to an extent be able to move up and downstream. Things like sticklebacks make seasonal migrations, lamprey species do, eels do, loads and loads of these creatures. They need to be able to move freely, and if they can't, you fragment the populations, and they become much more vulnerable to local extinction. If anything goes wrong in a bit of river and it's isolated, then there's no way for it to recolonize. So barriers are a big problem to things trying to move up and down the river, but also out of the river onto the floodplain and back. The river should be able to spill reasonably naturally out into its wet woodlands and meadows and spill back in. And that allows things like eels, tench, even pike, all these things to use these little floodplain areas, ponds on the floodplain, ditches and back channels and oxbow lakes. They can get on and off the floodplain safely, and they'll be able to be washed back in the next big flood once they're growing big enough. But because we've dug rivers deeper and deeper for better and better drainage, as we've done that, it's got harder and harder for the fish and the other wildlife to escape onto and interact with the floodplain. So that's a big problem. There's no floodplain connectivity left, or very little. Easy to put back, as I'll fairly easy, as I'll say in a minute. Siltation's a huge problem for us. One of the absolute key habitats in well, most of England's rivers actually are the gravel beds, that, you know, where the river flows fast, it should be keeping the gravel clean and washing it through, washing clean water through and oxygen through, and maintaining the space between the individual little chunks of gravel. And those spaces are where a lot of the fish lay their eggs. So trout and bullhead in particular are big gravel spawners. They need those gravel beds to spawn in, and they need that flush of water to oxygenate the eggs. Lots and lots of the invertebrate species, particularly the mayflies, also the caddisflies, they need the gravel beds to spawn. And what happens is when the river silts up, which it does for two reasons, silt is basically soil that's washed off fields or road verges into the river. If the river's been straightened and widened, it can't then shift that silt. An unnatural river channel can't deal with it. And that smothers the gravels, and you lose a lot of your good habitat and a lot of your abundance and diversity. Straightening of rivers really exacerbates that. Again, it's allowed us to be extraordinarily successful at food production. If you can straighten a river and push it out of the way to the side of the floodplain, that either makes you feel easier to graze or even makes it easier to crop, which is great. But a straight channel's got no flow diversity. It doesn't have the fast and slow water and the shallow and deep water. It becomes a very uniform thing, and it's not capable of pushing that silt through and keeping itself clean. It can't do that. So straightening's a problem, and putting meanders back in rivers is something that we also really try to do. Try to put that diversity of habitat back. Nutrient balance, I think, is becoming, or we're realizing that it's more and more important. And basically nutrient balance is a function of pollution. Pollution is what we're really talking about. Things like phosphates and nitrates, all natural things that are naturally found in the environment, and are very good plant fertilizers. But what's happening is we're getting huge inputs of this stuff from sewage works, from agricultural runoff, from industry as well, things like industrial laundries. Phosphates coming in from everywhere. Everything you eat has got phosphate in it. Every living creature poos phosphate. All our detergents have got phosphates in. It's coming in from absolutely everywhere. And what it does is it unbalances the ecosystem. Some plants absolutely thrive on that, to the extent where they'll dominate other native species, and it gives you a real reduction in the diversity of life in the ecosystems. It's a big problem. I'll talk about ways to deal with that in a minute. And there are several more. Climate change is obviously a problem. We're getting more and more floods and droughts. We've seen that really quite badly in the last 2 years. Bad droughts and then bad flooding through the winter. River management can be a huge problem. Abstraction for drinking, you know, we all use a lot of water, and we all eat the potatoes it's sprayed on, so it's everybody's problem, but that is all water that would otherwise be in the aquifer sustaining the river. Invasive species are a big problem on the Wensum, signal crayfish in particular. You can see the native, much more modest white-clawed crayfish on the right-hand side there as you look at it. Really absolutely fascinating creatures, beautiful to look at. But their huge problem is the invasive signal crayfish you can see on the left. These have been brought in by people originally to grow on as food in ponds and things, but they've escaped. They're absolutely everywhere, and it's just the same as the red squirrels and the grey squirrels. These things absolutely, they don't just dominate the native crayfish, they dominate the whole river. You can see the bottom left picture. Those are crayfish burrows in the bank. They're not waterfall burrows. They burrow into straight banks. They make them very unstable. They release a huge amount of silt, and at the same time, the crayfish are burrowing. They're also eating absolutely everything in sight. They're absolutely incredible, really quite impressive creatures, but eating and outcompeting a huge amount of our native wildlife. And I think as well, to me, that the Wensum's a bit of a problem in reverse. I think because it's the main river that's been designated as the special area of conservation, and the main river that has received a lot of conservation effort. But I think a lot of the problem is in the headwaters. I think the Wensum really suffers in that a lot of these tiny little feeder streams, again, because it's such good farmland, they've been squeezed and squeezed down to nothing, to the point where some of them are little more than ditches now. And this should be where a lot of the life is. This is what chalk stream headwaters should look like, but they just don't anymore. And it really is absolutely critical, because this is where the water supply is coming from. And if this isn't clean, if there's arable runoff in there, or if you've got septic tanks or sewage works or whatever else you might have feeding the tributaries, that is a big problem for the main river. And equally, the loss of that habitat. So a lot of the fish, like the trout are the classic example, they'll run up these streams to spawn. So will a lot of the other species. But if the habitat's ripped out of the smaller streams and tributaries, they're in massive trouble. But this is more onto the positive part of the presentation. We can do stuff about all of this. We can fix pretty much everything. We know what the problems are. In almost all the cases, we know how to fix those problems. We know how to identify those problems. We know what to do. It's just we need funding to do it. Not just Norfolk Rivers Trust, I'll come on to in a minute, but conservationists in general. We need public pressure to do it, and we need landowner buy-in. Norfolk's so privately owned that anytime you want to restore any bit of river, you've got to convince the person who owns that bit of river that it's the right thing to do. And that can bring challenges, especially for farms. You know, allowing good river restoration quite often means giving up a little bit of farmable land. So that can be a challenge. But we can do it. And this is kind of a headwater natural restoration here. I've used this as a really good illustration of trees in rivers and what headwaters should look like. Excuse me a minute. And all this is a tree that's collapsed into the water. But as soon as it does that, you get back flow diversity. You can see there's fast water and slow water in there. Instant diversity. Some creatures like the fast, some creatures like the slow. So suddenly you're catering for both. There's shallow and deep water, and again, some creatures like shallow water, some like deep water. Downstream, immediately downstream of the fallen tree, the water's really rushing through. That'll clean the gravels. So there'll be a nice little clean gravel bed kicked up downstream of there. You can see a bit in the far bank actually. And a pool might form under the branches or back up behind the branches. And again, that's different habitats. So in this really tiny space, maybe, I don't know, 8 meters of river by 3 meters of river, suddenly you've got quite amazing habitat diversity. And when you've got all those different habitats, the fast and the slow and the shallow and the deep, that's where things really thrive, because you're creating homes for everything. And the wood adds a whole lot more as well. So the wood is physically shelter, fish and invertebrates shelter in that from predation. That's quite hard for an otter to pull an eel out of, or a kingfisher to hook a minnow out of. That's quite hard hunting habitat. And the same for the invertebrates. Fish will find it much harder to pinch the bugs out of there. So it's shelter as well. Also, the rotting wood's amazing food for a lot of those species that live in there. They live off rotting wood and dead leaves. So it's food as well. It's all these things. It's habitat, it's shelter, it's food. And to me also, it looks amazing. That's proper wilderness when you've got a tree in a river. So that's one of the key things we do. Anywhere we can do that on the Wensum or in Norfolk, we will. We are, and we will continue dropping trees in rivers. Obviously, it's got to be done in a safe way that's not going to cause flooding to anybody's houses. That kind of goes without saying. We only do it appropriately, but that is instant river restoration, and nature will do that if you allow it to. We've taken this a step further recently. So this is on a Wensum tributary. I don't have any aerial photos from before we did this, but what I've tried to do here is mimic exactly what beavers do. So if you can imagine, historically, this has been dredged. The riverbed's way lower than it should be. It's straighter than it should be. It's got a silt bed, and there's not a great deal of life in there. So what we did was we took a digger and we pushed trees in and we pinned them in place, pretty much as a beaver would do. And there's so many objectives to this, I probably can't even explain them all, but that instantly, excuse me, that's my timer telling me to get on with it. That instantly raises the water level behind the mimic beaver dam and pushes it out onto the floodplain, which in this case is exactly what the farmer wanted, and is a very good thing. That's reducing flood risk downstream, because suddenly you're allowing the floodplain to hold water again like it hasn't been allowed to do for decades and decades. Also, it creates habitat diversity, as I just explained before. Downstream of the beaver dam, there'll be a rush of water. Upstream, a bit of standing water. So suddenly you don't just have a river, suddenly you've got a bit of a pool there, which is slow enough for things like dragonflies to use, that won't just use a kind of regular running channel. And you can see it's not just river and dry land anymore. Suddenly it's river merging into dry land. There are wetland margins and rushes and lilies and all kinds of things in there. And again, this is really quite easy to do, very cheap to do. It's not hard stuff. It's just finding the right landowner and a little bit of funding. This is another one, also on a Wensum tributary, and it's the same idea. We're just trying to put that water back into the environment. Rivers shouldn't be constrained. They shouldn't be 6 meters wide and then it's riverbank and dry land and that's it. They should be 6 meters wide, and then you should have a merging gradient of wetness up onto the floodplain and the marshes, and then you should have a old channel, a meander bend behind it, or an oxbow lake, and a pond in the floodplain. And it should be meters and meters and meters away from the river before it's properly drying out and you don't know the river's there. So we're really trying to expand that corridor. And in doing that, we're creating space for wildlife, and we're also trying to create an abundance of wildlife. So if we're creating good invertebrate habitat, all those midges that are living in there, insignificant little things, that's a bloom of food for visiting swallows and warblers and things. So a different tributary. This again was reasonably simple. So this was, we thought, an old oxbow. You could see it from aerial photographs and maps. The river used to run through this channel. It had been cut off, I think naturally probably cut off by the river at some point, but then it had been filled in. Again, for good arable reasons, it had been filled in, and at some point somebody had probably made an effort to crop this field, or at least graze it. And when you fill that in, you lose that associated habitat. It's not the actual river, but it's some of that habitat that belongs alongside it, which is really quite special. So the standing water nearby supports a whole different array of plants. It supports amphibians and dragonflies that aren't found in the flowing water, different invertebrates, different fish species. So putting all that back is really, really important work, I think. This is a similar thing seen from above on the Blackwater, that the kind of South Bank Blackwater rather than the Reefham Blackwater that goes up towards Brisley in that direction. And what we've done here is this is a fake, really. You can see the existing river channels quite obviously, the centre of the picture. And then if you look at natural river systems, again, it's not a single channel through the floodplain. There are braided channels and water features everywhere. So we're trying to add habitat. We've put in this is a, well, you can't see me waving the mouse actually, sorry. But you can see the kind of pond, which also acts as a silt trap. The photos taken in summer, you can see it's really quite dry. But as soon as this water raises up in winter, it's rushing into the pond there, dropping a lot of its silt, making its way down that the newly created channel at the top there. So suddenly you've got two river channels where you had one. We've put associated wetlands on that to kind of allow the river to expand and breathe, really. And yeah, that's kind of a good illustration of the kind of thing that Norfolk Rivers Trust trying to do. We want the Wensum to be a big target. We're very hopeful about the future of the Wensum. With huge thanks to Kelvin, who's in the audience tonight, actually. Kelvin Allen of the Angling Trust has worked really hard over the last few years to sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, to bring a lot of groups together, which I'll tell you about in a minute. What I did say I'll talk about is how we sort out the nutrient problem. This is something we haven't done this on the, well, we've done it on a small scale on the Wensum, but not with sewage works. So a lot of nutrients come out of sewage works, as do microplastics and pharmaceuticals and fire retardants and antidepressants and things. Something that we're starting to do where we can now is to build wetlands below sewage works. So whereas this works used to discharge into the stream, we now run it through this wetland. It's a series of shallow ponds, and you can and then back into the river. And this is what they look like when they establish. So it's a massive filter. It's a huge filter bed. Physically, it's very hard for anything to push its way through, whether that's a fibre of plastic or it's an E. coli bacteria. It's very hard to work its way through there. But also with all the life in there, that's absolutely thriving and mopping up all the excess nutrients. It's breaking down a lot of the chemicals. There might be some quite happy little shrimps in there on the antidepressants and some quite confused ones on the birth control tablets, but they're mopping all this stuff up before it hits the river. These wetlands don't have to be attached to sewage works. We've done a lot of these farm wetlands on the Wensum actually, and we can do them on things like indoor pig units and poultry units. Anywhere there's pollution, a wetland's going to help that. If you run it through a wetland, it'll clean it. And over the next few years, this is something we really want to see more and more of in the Wensum. Which brings me back to Kelvin and his conservation group. So something that conservationists have probably rightly been criticised for years and years is not working together and not talking to each other. So there'd be me out doing the river and another guy on the farm giving different advice about stone curlew and somebody giving different advice about woodland. And that's quite conflicting. Ecology is massively complicated. Everybody's got different ideas about it. Nearly all of those ideas are right to a point, and probably none of them are right 100%. So it's quite difficult to communicate, but what we're really trying to do now is work together very well. This is the last slide I want to leave you with, because I think this is the future for the Wensum. Don't worry about what the slide's showing and the detail on it. What I want to show you is that all these people are working together. Again, mostly thanks to Kelvin, who's in the audience. So we've now got coming together very regularly to talk just about the Wensum and how we make it better and how we fix it. We've got the Environment Agency, Norfolk Rivers Trust, Anglian Water, the Drainage Board, Natural England. We've got brilliant work from a group of farmers, the Upper Wensum Cluster Farm Group. This is a group of farmers who've come together that they've decided that they want their bit of river cleaner, they want it healthier, and they're doing everything they can to make that happen, working together as a group. And that's been phenomenal, actually. We've got Norfolk County Council, we've got Norfolk Farm and Wildlife Advisory Group, Broadland Catchment Partnership, got people from UEA, every conservation body you can pretty much imagine is now there and talking to each other and trying hard to make the Wensum better. And on that note of positivity, I will end the talk. By all means, do get in touch if you've got any interest in what I've just been saying. I should say, actually, if you've got concerns about pollution, let us know, but report that immediately to the Environment Agency, please. That this is a big thing we have. If you've got an immediate concern, we don't have power. We like to make things better. The Environment Agency have some power. But please get in touch about absolutely anything. That's our Twitter address, our Instagram account, and our website and email address. I've said to Andrew, I'm more than happy to take questions. So thank you very much for listening, and back over to Andrew, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Jonah. I suggest we just go straight to the questions. We've got sort of 5 minutes of official time, but we can sort of go on beyond that as long as you want to, and the questions come in. So I've collected a few. Perhaps we could start on the one about eel passes and general passes for the fish. people have been saying in the chat these are man-made features, but are they those barriers? Why have they become worse in recent times? I think that's really what a number of questions are getting at. And are there workable solutions to making less of a barrier in some way?
Yes, there are workable solutions. A lot of them have become worse. A lot of the structures used to be rickety wood, particularly at the mills and workable sluices. When they've broken down in recent years, they're replaced by things like high density plastic and aluminium that are very hard to climb, and they don't leak, so you don't get things squeezing through. So that really hasn't helped. For the eels in particular, at the same time, they've been hit with a huge number of problems. They're losing habitat everywhere. I think places like Scandinavia and Spain have been really badly hit by massive hydropower dams, just cutting off whole river catchments for them. They've had a disease, all kinds of things have gone wrong for eels. The good news is there are now eel regulations. Anytime any weir owner does any work on that weir, they're obliged to try to make it passable to eels now. So there is quite a drive to do that. It's slow work. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of barriers just in Norfolk, a lot of which the Environment Agency don't know about, we don't know about. So it's slow work, but it's happening slowly.
One's just come up in the chat from Lottie Packman, which I think probably a lot of people are interested in. She says the burning question, of course, what do you envisage the impact of the proposed Norwich Western Link dual carriageway would be on the River Wensum, including the planned viaduct across the river and, of course, the floodplains too?
That is the burning question. So what I don't like to do is comment on things like this without fully understanding what I'm talking about. And I haven't been able to analyse the plans in any depth. Having said that, we've objected formally as a Rivers Trust, and there are some very obvious concerns. One that's not particularly Rivers Trust to me is the carbon cost of the whole thing, and the future carbon cost just seems ridiculous. But for the river, we're worried about big roads generate horrific runoff, things like brake dust off the brake pads and particles off the tyres, and soot and oil all ends up on the road, and any water that's on the road ends up in the river. In cases, and probably in this case, there would be traps built to try and manage some of that pollution, but it's a big threat. And there was just a paper published recently about the effect this is actually having on fish populations in America, but it's exactly the same situation. So pollution's an issue. Construction in the actual river is an issue, probably not the biggest one, but it's certainly not ideal. And the effects on the wider catchment, I think, I used the two maps earlier to illustrate that the Wensum relies on all this habitat around it, and if you put a big A road through that, you're damaging a lot of that habitat, and all these things depend on each other. So the heron that you see on the river probably nests in the woods, and the bats that feed over the river nest in the woods, and the water voles need the meadow habitat around, and all those things. So I think that there are multiple threats there. I don't really want to be specific because I haven't been able to look at the details of the planning, but yeah, it's a concern. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jonah. Let's see. There was one actually quite amusing at the beginning about will pike and other fish bite swimmers. Don't know if you can answer that one way or
One of my colleagues has got pike scar.
Oh, really?
But that's not from swimming. I've never heard of a pike go for swimmer ever. Ursula got her scar. She was with a fishing club, and a young boy pulled out quite a big pike and couldn't get the hook out of it, so she went in and did it, but she got bitten, which was worth it. She saved the pike. I've never heard of pike going for swimmers. I don't know. I do give it a thought when I get in there, but I think that's needless.
And then one from Lucy Galvin. Do you think we'll ever see beavers on the Wensum? Would they be good to manage parts of it?
This might be Lucy trying to set me up here, Lucy. I would love to see beavers on the Wensum. I really would. It's something Norfolk Rivers Trust are very supportive of, for a whole lot of reasons. I was saying earlier about the mimic beaver dams, but beavers just recreate habitat instantly. They spread the river out over the floodplain. They create habitat diversity, and you get a massive change in abundance of invertebrates. You get an increase in fish abundance. I know that there are issues with fish passage as well for things like salmon and sea trout, but that seems to be outweighed by the quality of nursery habitat the beavers create. For me, that isn't the main reason. The main reason is that there are a lot of studies, particularly from the University of Exeter, on the beavers that have been released in Devon and the cleansing effects they have on the water. A single beaver dam can take out a vast proportion of the silt and a vast proportion of the nutrients coming down the river. It can also hold water back. So if the beavers are in the headwaters, they can help hold water up there, which doesn't really help flooding issues, I don't think, in Norfolk. I wouldn't try and sell it as that, but it certainly helps prevent drought issues, which we're seeing more and more of. So yeah, to me, I think that'd be brilliant, not for the beavers as such, although they're a native thing and great to see back there, but for what they do for the habitat and the water quality and the drought prevention. Yeah.
And then we've got one on the wetlands downstream of sewerage works. Great idea, says James Cross, but there's a couple of questions. One's freezing over in winter can prevent the filtration. Any thoughts on the impact on those when it freezes over? And also sort of regulations have sort of stopped, building regulations have stopped some of them happening apparently. So any thoughts on those two, Jonah?
Yeah, so there is a dip in performance when they get cold. And if they were to freeze over, then performance wouldn't be anything like it would be in the middle of summer. So the ones that we've built so far take out anything from sort of 60 up towards 90% of the actual amount of phosphate coming through. And that performance is better in summer. And it drops off a little bit in winter. They're quite protected from seasonality in a way. A lot of the action isn't the plants growing, it's the microbial layers beneath. And that's actually quite a stable environment. It's fed by relatively warm water from the sewage works. And the temperature doesn't change that much down there. It's massively buffered by a huge blanket of vegetation over it. So even during the beast from the east, we didn't see ice on ours. And they do still perform. They drop off a little bit for sure. Planning, yes, they're not always. You can't have them everywhere below every sewage works. You wouldn't want them in a spot that's likely to flood out regularly. And yeah, there are a lot of obstacles sometimes, but equally there are a lot of places where you can have them.
And one from Jen. Could you say something about the RiverTud? Of course, the RiverTud is a tributary, just comes off at Tavram Mill, so it's very close to Norwich, and it's close to this possible site of the road. It's close to the A47 as well, where there's dual carriageway planned.
Yes, I could say some things about the River Tud. It's a mixed bag. So there's some really nice bits there with some really nice habitat. It still has a population of white-clawed crayfish, although they're threatened by signals pretty much right next door to them. It's got some really nice fish habitat. It's got some damaged bits. Yeah, going up towards Yaxon, I think. And then some quite nice bits again right at the top. It will be impacted. I've stood under the A Road bridge on the Tud, and there will be impacts from that, definitely. But yeah, in places, a really nice bit of river. Yeah.
And then we've got one from Lottie. I'll read it out 'cause it's slightly long one. Are the lower stretches of the river likely to be more rich and productive in insect life? The lower River Wensum is exceptionally good, nationally important for the rare barbstell bat, which forage and commute along the riparian habitat corridor. Is there likely to be more insect prey for them in the lower section of the river? They primarily feed on moths, but also other insects, including caddisflies.
Possibly so. I think if there is, it's just because the river and the floodplain are bigger down there, and there's more habitat. So I don't know. The river's 10 times wider, and the floodplain's 50 times wider. And around places like Ringland, it's a functioning floodplain, and that brings good invertebrate diversity. I don't think lowland rivers are particularly more productive than headwater streams, but just because of the actual size of the habitat down there, I think it is. I think river flies are, well, they're definitely very important for breeding birds, and I guess the same for bats. Yeah.
Good. I'm just trying to check whether we've got any other questions I've missed.
Andrew, there are quite a lot of people asking if they wanted to volunteer for the Rivers Trust. I think that's really important, or wanted to get involved. How can they do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we don't. We're not as big as Norfolk Wildlife Trust, so we don't have a managed volunteer program. But what we do have is a list of volunteers that we'll contact when we're doing certain works in their area that are useful. So we don't have something every Sunday that people can come along and do, but we definitely do have volunteering opportunities. If you want to get in touch, the email address is on the website, just info@norfolkriverstrust.org, and just let us know what you're interested in, and yeah, that'd be brilliant. Put you on the list and be in touch. Yeah.
So, are there any other questions?
Yes, Kelvin, can I just come in?
Yes, please.
Thanks, Jonah, for the pet talk. Wonderful. We should have been doing this 3 years ago. But we are where we are. It's great stuff. What we can say is, on the upper reaches of the river, we have applied for funding to set up basically a set of community river wardens. And if that fund is successful, we will have training costs and all the kit to actually instigate a bunch of river wardens, so we can actually get on top of some of this stuff that Jonah's explained quite well. So that's we're tackling the top end of the river first. We can't do the whole river at 75 kilometers. So and I think, as Jonah's explained, it's quite detailed, to be truthful.
Yeah.
And bringing the landowners with us is really important. So yeah, I'm pleased, and I think at the moment that map, that diagram that Jonah showed, I think we're currently at 84 stakeholders the last time I looked. So more the merrier, to be truthful. Join our merry band.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Jonah. The amazing talk, really, really interesting. And it seems, just on the note, from Kelvin there, about sort of making the river better, bringing in community river wardens and so on, that we're on the sort of cusp of being able to turn around what's been happening to the river for sort of 20, 30 years particularly. Yet, we've also got this cloud hanging over with the road, and it really feels to me, if we can get the road out the way, then there's real opportunity for sort of really positive stuff to happen in the Wensum, sort of, green lung out of the city, right out into West Norfolk, and sort of rewilding and so on. So it's been incredibly inspiring to hear about, you know, all the different species which live there. I've sort of seen some of these things on the internet so far, but this is, you know, I know a bit more about them after tonight. So it's been fantastic. So I'd just like to say thank you, and thank you for everybody who's come and listened to this. It's been, we've had up to 85 people, so it's been really good.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Right. Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, night.